Welcome everyone to today's discussion under the title, The Kurds' New Clout in U.S. Ties with Turkey and Iraq. I'm Mark Sheeland. I'm Director of Programs and Government Relations at the Middle East Institute. It's a great pleasure for MEI and our Center for Turkish Studies to bring you this event. We are video recording today, so I'd like to ask that you silence your mobile phones. You'll be able to find the video and podcast of today's event on our website in the next few days. Our format today will follow MEI convention in that we have a well-informed and engaging moderator who will set the direction, and we will hear brief opening statements from three experts with complementary perspectives and remarkable expertise. After the presentations, we'll have a panel discussion driven by a round of questions from the chair and then by you in the audience. So please be ready with crisp, brief questions when your time comes. There are biographic notes about each of our participants in the flyer that I hope you picked up on the way in today. I simply want to welcome them by name. Our panelists are Denise Natali, Senior Research Fellow at the National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies here in Washington, Mohammed Sharif of the Royal Asiatic Society London, the University of Exeter in the UK, and the University of Sulaymaniyah in Iraq, Gönül Tol, founding director of MEI's Center for Turkish Studies and an adjunct professor at George Washington University. I should mention Dr. Shareef also is the author of a new release, The United States, Iraq, and the Kurds. We have flyers about his new book out at the check-in table as well today. Our moderator is Daniel Serwer, Senior Research Professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and a Fellow at the Middle East Institute. Our discussion today of the Kurds as a factor in U.S. regional security policy and in broader relations with Iraq and Turkey is extremely timely, I think. As reported in the news media earlier this week, the Defense Authorization Bill that was under discussion in the House Armed Services Committee included a provision to, in effect, deem the Kurdish Peshmerga forces in Iraq's north as a country. The nominal purpose of the provision was to allow these security forces to directly receive assistance from the United States. I expect we will hear views today on the practicability and wisdom of direct military funding for the Kurds and other subnational forces combating the Islamic State in Iraq, but also some thoughts on the wider political impulses that could result. Before I hand off to Dan Serwer to lead us through the next 90 minutes or so, I want to remind you to visit our website at www.mei.edu frequently to stay aware of upcoming events and to enjoy the analyses and commentaries of our scholars and contributors. We had two relevant op-eds in hard copy for you at the check-in table today, but there's so much more on the website. We're also pleased to point out that MEI is extending its programming reach well beyond Washington. We are co-sponsor with the Egyptian Foreign Ministry, the Antiquities Coalition, and UNESCO of a two-day conference in Cairo, May 13th and 14th, addressing the looting and trafficking in antiquities and cultural artifacts and the role of such crimes in financing the Islamic State and regional terrorism. We encourage you to watch for news coming out of that international conference. With that, I will close with thanks again to all of you for attending today and give the floor to Dan Serwer.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm not going to say much except to add that the moment really is a very good one to be discussing the role of the Kurds in the Middle East situation today. President Barzani will be here next week. I'll hope to hear from the panelists what he'll be asking for and what the Americans will be asking of him as well. But I also think we should delve into some of those things that have somehow fallen below the radar. I'm particularly interested in the question of the current status of what I think of as the Baghdad deal, oil for money deal, which I think, at some point seemed a great breakthrough, and today seems, I don't know what it seems any longer. Maybe unfulfilled is the right word to use for it. And of course, whatever is happening in this part of the world is happening in the context of a war between a coalition and the Islamic State that both takes advantage of whatever pre-existing political and military forces existed, and at the same time is changing the relationship among them in ways that may have permanent effects on the region. I don't do biographic introductions. Mohammed has reminded me that he has seen me chair sessions of this sort in the past, so he is well aware that I'll try to limit him to 15 minutes. And Denise and Gönül are young friends who, and there are people, I can't think of people whom I'd rather hear from on this subject in Washington. So we have a treat awaiting us for the next hour and a half, and Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm especially thankful to the Middle East Institute and Dr. Gul Tol for arranging and organizing this talk. Basically, what I'll try to do today is argue that the Kurdistan region of Iraq is emerging as a potential power in the Middle East, and I'll try to put forward my case. Okay. First of all, I'd like to start off with one of my favorite quotes. This is a quote by King Faisal in 1932. Ladies and gentlemen, I genuinely believe what he said 84 years ago applies today. The people of Iraq, the loyalties of the people of Iraq lay elsewhere before their loyalty to the nation state of Iraq, and this specifically applied to the Kurds of Iraq in particular. And based on this, we can forward our argument. First of all, we all know that the Kurdistan region of Iraq was accidentally created, mostly as a result of the collapse of the Kurdish uprising in 1991 and the protection of the Kurdistan region under the no-fly zones, under US, British, and French protection, followed by parliamentary elections in 1992. So this was the start of the Kurdistan region as an entity. I would like to argue today that the Kurdistan region is emerging as a potential power. With the agency to change some of the patterns in the Middle East, it is emerging as a subject of the international relations of the Middle East, as opposed to an object, as opposed to a pawn that it previously was known for. We can see, as a result of a combination of various domestic, regional, and international factors, that the Kurdish liberation movement has seen a transition, an evolution. From 1961 to 1991, it was a nationalist movement. From 92 to 2004, it was more of a non-state actor. But after 2005 and the ratification of the Iraqi constitution, it is behaving and performing more like a state-like actor in the Middle East. What we can say based on this is that the Kurdistan region of Iraq is gradually consolidating. It has a permanent population. It has a territorially defined space. It has a government which is legitimate and elected democratically by its people. And we can see that it has the ability to enter into relations with regional and international powers. The Kurdistan region of Iraq, I would argue, as an academic, is pursuing two strategies. On the one hand, it is engaging Baghdad to secure the constitutional rights of the Kurds within the permanent constitution that was ratified in October 2005. But parallel to that, there is a strategy, an unpronounced strategy that advances the cause for self-determination, which is a requisite and requirement of all Kurds. I would like to argue a combination of three factors that is allowing the Kurds to emerge as a potential actor in the Middle East. First of all, a domestic factor, secondly, an economic factor, and thirdly, an interventionist foreign policy factor. Starting off with the domestic factor, I would like to argue, ladies and gentlemen, that in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, we have a sense of nationhood. If you ask a Kurd in Zakho or in Khanaqin, they would not say they are from Iraq. They would say they are from Kurdistan. This is an important point that I would like to highlight. If you were to ask a Kurd in Erbil about the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Health, they would be referring to the Ministry of Agriculture and Health in Erbil, not to the Ministry of Agriculture and Health in Baghdad. Baghdad is seen as detached and an alien entity, irrelevant to the Kurds. We can see a cohesiveness of Kurdish society. There's a common memory of suffering, of sacrifices, and obviously we can see a cohesiveness of Kurdish territory. The Kurdish territory is not detached, it's not fragmented, it's one continuous part. And obviously we have the Kurdistan Regional Government. There are obviously certain flaws and problems, but it is a legitimate government representing the Kurdish people of Iraq. Second, we have the hydrocarbon conditions that are advancing the Kurdish entity. The Kurdistan region now ranks the 10th in oil and gas reserves at the global level, with 45 billion barrels of oil of reserves and 110 trillion cubic feet of gas as reserves. This is a huge economic factor. We have more than 50 oil companies active now in the Kurdistan region, with 4 major mega oil companies currently active, 2 of them American, ExxonMobil, Chevron, French Total, and the Russian Gazprom Neft. These are all changing the status of the Kurds. Through this, the Kurds are trying to achieve economic independence. By the end of 2014, ladies and gentlemen, the Kurdistan region of Iraq was alone. The territories confined to the Kurdistan region jurisdiction was able to produce 500,000 barrels of oil per day. By the end of 2015, it has been forecasted it will reach 1 million barrels per day. And by the end of 2019, 2 million barrels per day as per sources from the Kurdistan region. The Kurdistan region has an economic strategy. It wants to attract investment. The liberal investment law that was passed by the Kurdistan Parliament in 2006 is one of the most liberal laws in the Middle East. There are more than 3,000 foreign companies working now in the Kurdistan region. The Kurdistan region is also pursuing a strategy allowing 25 to 35% of the profits to go to be awarded to international oil companies. This is to divert oil companies from Baghdad. On the other hand, we can see that Baghdad is being more stringent and restricted, only allowing 15 to 18%, awarding service contracts to oil companies. The political objectives, obviously, behind this is to demonstrate that the Kurdistan region can be economically viable, that it can be a major contributor to international oil markets. It can help maintain and reduce oil prices. It's trying to gain diplomatic recognition. Currently, there are 29 representatives of diplomatic representations in the capital, Erbil. It's trying to practice independence beyond Baghdad and through that obviously gain political support. Currently, the Kurdistan Regional Government has an income, can make an income of $400 million per month. But ladies and gentlemen, for the daily running of this entity, the Kurdistan region needs $1 billion. So there is a gap at the moment. The Kurdistan Regional Government is trying to fill this gap, and it's part of its strategy. Thirdly, another major contributing factor is the foreign policy side. We can see that the Kurdistan region was quite frustrated from 1961 to 1971. It was trying to maintain contacts or establish contacts, but it wasn't receiving a lot of attention. From 1972 to 1975, there were covert contacts with regional and international powers. Then, following that, after the Kurdish uprising from 1991 to 2004, we had more of an overt contact. And after the ratification of the Iraqi constitution, in which the Kurdistan region has been recognized, Kurdistan's relations with regional international powers have become more institutionalized, as we can see. So we can make the case that the Kurdish problem has evolved, has transitioned from a problem to a question. There are three interrelated strategies that have led to the emergence of the Kurdistan region as a potential power. I'll briefly try and go through them. First of all, the consolidation of the Kurdistan region as an entity. That's a major important factor. And by 2011, we saw the polarization of Iraqi politics, with the Sunnis and the Kurds on one side and President Barzani being in a preeminent political position, and on the other hand, we had the Shiite-led government of Nouri al-Maliki. This, from a Kurdish perspective, was more focused upon federalism, but from a Sunni perspective, it was more a sectarian issue. The second major point that is allowing the Kurdistan region to gradually emerge as a potential power is its attitudes with regards to oil and gas policy. The Kurdistan region, as I said previously, is also pursuing and attracting foreign direct investment. This is also a major factor towards fiscal independence and economic independence. This is allowing the Kurdistan region to become more consolidated and more independent. And thirdly, we have the issue of foreign affairs. The broader security and national interests of the Kurdistan region of Iraq are gradually overlapping with those of Turkey and the Gulf states. By association, we could make the argument that the Kurdistan region, by association, and due to these various events, these sectarian wars in the Middle East, the rise of the Islamic State is gradually emerging on the side of a Sunni, of a de facto Sunni alliance, and on the other hand, you have the alliance of the Shia world with Iran in the lead. But having provided a positive perspective, I would also like to make the argument that the Kurds are still vulnerable. Generally speaking, their status has not changed in the Middle East. We can say that they're emerging as a potential power. When needed as a pawn, they are respected and valued. When irrelevant, they are deemed insignificant. But overall, they remain an asset and an ally to the United States in the Middle East, and this is hugely important. The place of the Iraqi Kurds in terms of its relations with the United States tends to be renegotiated all the time, based on three major factors, partly based on what is happening in Baghdad from the US perspective, and partly on US ties with regional states in the region, and thirdly, partly on how the United States sees its long-term interests and role in the Gulf. And thank you again for your patience. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Denise.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, the Middle East Institute, Carnegie, Dan, for having me here. It's always a pleasure. Gönül asked me to speak on U.S. policy toward the Kurds, and I just need to make a disclaimer that I'm speaking on my own behalf, and though I work for the United States government, I am not speaking in behalf of Department of Defense or NDU or the U.S. government, nonetheless. When Gönül asked me to speak about the U.S. policy toward the Kurds, my first question usually is which ones? We've heard largely, Mohammed did so eloquently, talk about the Kurdistan region, but there are 25 to 30 million Kurds across 4 large states, the majority of whom are in Turkey. So when we talk about U.S. policy toward the Kurds, we need to say which ones and at what period in time, because this becomes far more complicated. than looking at a an Iraqi Kurdish Washington dialectic. I'm not going to make any arguments. I'm not an advocate for or against Kurds, but I do want to look at some of the tenets of the way that the U.S. government, and I qualify U.S. government because, as you know, there's the Congress. What was introduced the other day is, I would say, some type of controversial bill that was proposed, and then different facets of the government. But I'm going to look at official U.S. policy, not those of some congressmen. So there will be, and then we can possibly answer some of Dan's questions about oil, and that'll come out of it. I don't agree that the story has not been as rosy, in my view, as Mohammed has indicated. The region's about $17 billion in debt, and the oil gamble has been a catastrophe for local populations, and the region is quite destabilized. So, but nonetheless, we can talk about that later. What are some of the assumptions and premise of U.S. policy toward the Kurds? What are the continuities and changes, and what do I see as some of the challenges moving forward? Some of the presumptions and the premise has been the Westphalian state system. That is to say, I'm not going to give a whole history, but this is based on nation states, governments dealing with other nation states. So up to at least 1991, again, as Mohammed indicated, in the Gulf War, we were dealing with the states in which the Kurds have been part of. So you have the Kurds in Iraq, the Kurds were in Turkey, Iran, and Syria. Nonetheless, secondly, so that was a state issue. And then as the nature of the state or the sovereignty regime has changed over time, slightly been weakened, this is where you see the opportunities for direct or more direct relationships with the Kurds have emerged. And again, different Kurdish groups are qualified. Secondly, this is based on U.S. strategic interests. Some can say the word pawns. I don't think the United States has necessarily used the Kurds as pawns, but nonetheless, what are our strategic interests in a very geopolitically sensitive area, okay, region, changing threat perceptions and alliance structures. And third, we have to look at the Kurds. I know it's easy to say, look at the Kurdistan region, isn't it wonderful? But this is a relative. You know, it's a great study in relativism. The Kurdistan region's stable relative to Baghdad. It's a great ally, but we have a landlocked region with Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Gulf states. So when we're looking at our relationship with the Kurds, I wouldn't say it's just how we look at this emergent non-state actor, but how does that function as a part of our other relationships in the region? And those three premises has shaped some of our policy. So I'll argue, if there's an argument, as the traditional states, and some of these states have weakened in the Middle East, particularly Iraq and Syria, this has created these ungoverned spaces or opportunity structures in which Kurdish groups, non-state actors, can benefit. The Kurds in Iraq have benefited the greatest, and since the anti-ISIS campaign, you've seen groups in Turkey also taking advantage of these political and strategic or security vacuums. Nonetheless, so how have these consumptions played out? One, there hasn't been a clear U.S. policy. Because the U.S. policy has been grounded in state-to-state relations, dealing with the Kurds has been a function of the problems of each state within. And that is a function of the United States' relationship with each of these central governments. That meant, what did that turn into? It meant that we had different approaches to the Kurds. There were good Kurds and there were bad Kurds, right? The Iraqi Kurds were the good Kurds. They were fighting against Saddam. They became part of coalitions to fight and overthrow Saddam. They became part of fighting against Ansar, and so be it. And now the same goes to the anti-ISIS campaign. In Turkey, it was far more complex. This evolved from the post-Cold War. The Kurds in Turkey became part of a leftist movement. It was a far more violent movement. Turkey is a strong United States ally, a NATO member, so that those relationships that emerged and developed between the United States and Iraqi Kurds did not emerge with the Kurds in Turkey. The Kurds in Turkey are still considered a terrorist group, and that relationship has still affected how far this group can emerge as an actor. And find this, then with that, I'm not going to get into the Syrian Kurds until post-ISIS, and Iranian Kurds we'll leave aside for now. There's different legitimizing structures that have emerged with this, so that some of this has gone from clandestine support to, again, creating different opportunities. And that came when? When was the big change? 1991, in my view, when you had, after the Gulf War, you had the weakening of the Iraqi state. I was part of Operation Provide Comfort too, when we had the safe haven. So this was a time, again, when even when the Kurdistan Regional Government formed, I first went over at that time in 1992, this was where the state no longer had its reach. This is what I think we should be looking at, that the Iraqi central government could no longer get into the Kurdistan region, and so you had the emergence of more direct relationships, still on a humanitarian mission. So you had these very distinct relationships. With that, you had, again, changes over time in, I'm going to move up now to post-2003. Further weakening of the Iraqi state. What was different at this time was now the Kurdistan region became a legitimate structure. It wasn't just the Kurdistan region self-declared by its own elections, but part of a federal Iraqi state, a constitution, and in my view, that gave the Kurds three things: legitimacy, rights, revenues, and recognition. And it was from that constitutional arrangement that a more broad-based relationship and direct relationship between the United States and the Kurdistan Regional Government of one emerged. That's one part of it. The other part of it, again, was black gold, oil. So the Kurdistan region was also, through this new constitutional arrangement, able to engage in some of these, let's call it quasi-state building activities, and Mohammed's discussed all of that. I don't want to get into, again, all of the things that the Kurds have been able to do, but building a lobby has been extremely effective for the Kurds. And when you ask about U.S.-state relations, you're going to see one part of the U.S. government. And I think it's a mistake to think, because some congressmen keep drafting bills, that this is a change in U.S. policy. As far as my reading was yesterday, the White House made it clear that the U.S. policy toward Iraq remains unchanged, that the United States is committed to territorial integrity of Iraq. So we have to be very careful about what some draft bills say and what some congressmen want to do and what is official U.S. policy. Nonetheless, there have been overtures. There have been direct business relations with the Kurds, again, because this was part of what's considered as part of the Iraqi state. Now, what are some, and again, we saw this in another opportunity, which is the post-ISIS campaign. One of the big shifts I see is that for the first time, the bad Kurds have been semi-legitimized. They too are now this non-state actor of which the coalition has been tapping into to fight ISIS. So all of this would give the appearance that the Kurds are on the rise. This is going to be a change. We're now going to change our policy and start dealing directly with non-state actors. No, I don't think so. For some reasons. One, there's still a commitment to state sovereignty, no matter how weakened it has been. You've seen this in the oil gamble. I think, again, it's been, on one level, you can say it's been a success. The Kurds have got all this oil. By the way, the 500,000 barrels, half of which are Kirkuk's oil, which is being sold as Kirkuk oil. But nonetheless, I think that's been a catastrophic disaster for the region. Secondly, I think the geopolitical alliances that we just don't seem to be playing out in the media. Turkey matters, okay? Our regional relations matter. So that any of these ties that are developed with the Kurdistan Regional Government, which are important, will be evaluated in relation to our other partnerships and our other strategic interests. But there's a larger policy issue. So I think that there will be these relations that develop with these non-state actors, but the larger policy issue is, how are we going to address the emergence of these non-state actors? So that you do have, on the one hand, groups like the PYD in Syria, who we were not even working with years ago because they were considered part of the PKK, but now they're becoming coalition boots on the ground. The Kurds are coalition boots on the ground. How do you turn these local partnerships with non-state actors into some type of viable security alliance after ISIS? So how do you incorporate these alternative governance structures? I don't see this as the states are going to break apart, Sykes-Picot is over. I think this is very simplistic, and then therefore the Kurds are going to have a state. They're probably a middle ground. So therefore, we're not set up to deal institutionally with non-state actors. This is not a dichotomy between dealing with the Kurds and not. So what type of strategic partnerships does the United States want to develop? What do we want from the region? There is an increased recognition of the role of the Kurds, but again, in my view, the United States policy will still treat the Kurds as distinct entities within the states in which they live. And a final point, we rarely get into the divisions between the Kurds. We think of this as the United States and the Kurds. And when I say which ones, I don't just mean Iraq, Turkey, and Iran. I mean PUK, KDP. They are very, very divided right now. Even in terms of accessing military weapons. Most of it's going to the Barzani group. You've got other groups angry that they're not accessing it. So the Kurds have to get their house in order as well before you can, bang on the door of the United States and keep complaining that you're not getting heavy weapons directed to you. There are other non-state actors that the United States needs to and is assessing. Sunni Arab groups. What are the secondary consequences of directly arming the Kurds for the Kurds' own sake? This could have a very significant backlash on the Kurds and for our other partnerships. So these are very complicated questions. As we start getting into sub-state actors, it's not just about the United States and the one sub-state actor. What are the local dynamics in which these shifting alliance structures and balance of power will affect our strategic interests? And I'll close at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. Gönül.
Well, thank you, Ben. Today I want to briefly talk about Turkey's Iraqi Kurdish policy and why the Kurds are so relevant to the bilateral relations between US and Turkey, and then I'll talk about the most recent developments. Turkey has always had its own domestic Kurdish problem and seen the Kurds of the region from that perspective. And in fact, Turkey has built its regional policy, its policy vis-a-vis its immediate neighborhood on that Kurdish question. So Turkey for a long time viewed the KRG as a security threat and made very little distinction between the KRG and the PKK, despite the ideological differences, political differences. And Ankara always feared an autonomous region right on its southern border would empower and embolden its own Kurdish community, and therefore Turkey built its strategy on marginalizing the Kurdistan Regional Government. So Turkey has advocated that Kirkuk, which is an oil-rich city, should be given special status. So it cannot be under the Kurdish control, but should be given a special status in which all different ethnic identities are represented in a fair and balanced manner within the unity of Iraq. And Kurds have always been an important component of Turkish-US relations. And Washington and Ankara did not always see eye to eye on the Kurdish question. And it's been relevant for I think, three main reasons. And the first one is the Serwer syndrome, which is, I won't go into detail, but the original term refers to the Serwer treaty of the 1920s, which partitioned the Ottoman Empire. It was never implemented, and yet it left a deep scar in Turkish political culture. So in Turkey, there's been this popular belief that some outside forces, and especially the West, is conspiring to weaken and carve up Turkey. And of course, the Kurdish autonomy, de facto Kurdish autonomy after the first Gulf War did not help. It was a vindication of Turkish fears that the United States wanted to establish an independent Kurdistan. And of course, then came the 2005, then came the second Gulf War, which heightened Turkish fears. The 2005 Iraqi constitution confirmed Kurdistan's spatial status. And that created even more paranoia in Turkey. And I think the third one is, for a long time, Turkey has pressured the US into clamping down the PKK training camps in northern Syria. But the US remained reluctant to do so because due to northern Iraq's relative stability and because the US did not want to spare forces that would divert away from the more contentious areas of Iraq. So as a result, in 2007, the Turkish parliament passed a law that will allow Turkish military to go to intervene to northern Iraq. And of course, the US response was not what Ankara wanted Washington to do. The Bush administration stated that he did not believe it was in Turkey's interest to intervene into northern Syria. But starting from 2008, the tension between the US and Turkey was elevated because when the tension was alleviated when the Bush administration signed a deal with Ankara in 2008 to share intelligence with the Turkish side against the PKK. And that year, Turkey intervened in northern Iraq, and the Bush administration supported the Turkish intervention. So the tension was not there anymore. And also, the Turkish side recalibrated its own Kurdish policy. In 2009, Turkey launched a Kurdish opening in an effort to grant political and cultural rights to the Kurds. By 2009, the Turkish military, which has traditionally advocated a security-oriented approach to the Kurdish question and opposed any engagement with the Iraqi Kurds, was marginalized within Turkish politics. So the military was not in the picture. And there was a new foreign policy elite with a new vision that recognized that the traditional policy of alienating the Kurds domestically and regionally was ineffective. And it was not possible to solve a transnational problem without engaging the regional actors. So within that framework, Turkey opened a consulate in Erbil and officially recognized the Kurdistan Regional Government. And also went further and engaged Barzani in its own domestic peace process with the Kurds. But when Turkey started signing energy deals with the Kurdistan Regional Government without the approval of Baghdad, the Iraqi Kurds once again became the bone of contention in bilateral relations between Washington and the US. But this time, it was the US that was concerned about a possible independent Kurdistan. And despite US objections, Turkey went ahead and deepened energy ties with the Iraqi Kurds. And the rise of the Islamic State once again changed the dynamics in Iraq, and it posed complications for Turkey in Syria. In Iraq, the US and Turkish government, they were working closely with the Peshmerga. Turkey is training the Peshmerga forces, and the US is providing weapons. And in the meantime, Turkey continued to deepen the energy ties with Erbil. But the Obama administration's decision to airdrop weapons to the PYD, which is the PKK's Syrian offshoot, in Kobani to help its fight against the Islamic State, pissed Turkey off, because it was the US decision that forced Turkey to open the border to allow the Peshmerga forces go into Kobani, and that was something that the Turkish government was reluctant to do. But one day after the US administration airdropped weapons to the PYD in Kobani, Turkey had to open the border. And that created many problems for the AKP government, both domestically and regionally. Domestically, Erdogan's indifference to the suffering of the Kurds in Syria alienated many Kurds within his conservative Kurdish base. Traditionally, in Turkey, 50% of the Kurdish population is voted for center-right parties, and the other 50% is voted for the pro-Kurdish Nationalist Party. And Erdogan particularly has been very popular within the Turkish community in Turkey because of his efforts to launch the Kurdish peace process, and he has been the bravest Turkish leader to solve the Kurdish problem. But the Kobani incident was a turning point. It was a turning point not just for the Turkish government, but also it was a turning point for the Kurds in Turkey and in the region. So there are public opinion polls saying that some of those Kurds who voted for the AKP in 2014 local elections and 2011 general elections will vote for the pro-Kurdish HDP in the upcoming elections in June. And regionally, it creates complications as well. Reportedly, there are media reports, and the latest one was in Daily Beast 2 weeks ago. The US is helping the PYD in its fight against the Islamic State in Syria, and technically that doesn't pose a legal challenge for the US administration because the PYD is not on the terrorism list of the US government. But the PKK is. And the Daily Beast reports that American officials have been coordinating their attacks with the PKK in Iraq. And the PKK is on the US terrorist list. And I was recently in Diyarbakir, in the Kurdish region of Turkey. We were traveling from Diyarbakir, Mardin, and Cizre, and those are the Kurdish towns along Turkey's southern border. And the pro-US mood among the Kurds was striking. And after the Obama incident, after the Kobani, after the US decision to help the PYD in Kobani, there were signs, Kurds were carrying signs saying Biji Obama, which is in Kurdish, long live Obama. And on my trip, I've talked to Kurds who are anti-imperialists. Even they were very pleased and very pro-US. But that could create a problem for Turkey and maybe for the Kurds themselves, that pro-US. So the US action boosted their confidence, the confidence of Turkey's Kurds, which might lead to a de facto autonomy after the elections in June, if the pro-Kurdish party cannot make it to the parliament. So according to Turkish electoral law, there is a 10% electoral threshold. So if you cannot pass that threshold, you cannot be represented in the parliament. And the pro-Kurdish parties, traditionally, they have fielded independent candidates to circumvent that 10% threshold. But this year, they decided to run as a party, which is a very risky decision. And I think part of the reason is that boost that they have been receiving. In Kobani and even in Shengal in Iraq, the PKK fighters, I remember, the PKK militants, they were on the cover page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and European media outlets. Everyone was praising their efforts. They are secular, and they saved Christians and Yazidi minorities in Iraq who were in the hands of the Islamic State. So they received this, not just this military boost, but also diplomatic boost as well. And that really emboldened the Kurds regionally, but also the Kurds in Turkey. So, okay. I'll just 2 minutes. So if Turkey fails to solve its own domestic Kurdish problem, that's going to create the US engagement with the Syrian Kurds will create complications for Ankara-Washington relations. And I think there are potential challenges in Iraq as well. For now, Ankara and Washington seem to be on the same page with regard to the Kurds in Iraq. But the critical question is, what will happen once the Islamic State is under control? Because the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, now control Kirkuk. They capitalized on the chaos in the region, and now they are controlling Kirkuk. And Baghdad and Erbil signed an oil deal. According to the oil deal, the Kurds will sell the Kirkuk oil. I mean, there are more nuances, but I'm not going to go into detail. But Turkey quietly accepted the status quo. So after opposing the Kurdish control of Kirkuk for decades, now Turkey accepted the status quo. So the question is, once the Islamic State threat is under control, how will the US react to Turkey's selling of Kurdish oil from Kirkuk oil fields? Because that's going to be against US policy to keep Iraq unified. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to go right away to questions from the audience. I hope I have a microphone someplace. Yes, it's coming. I see it. It's walking forward. Why don't we take right here first? I think I'll take 2 questions at a time, so let's hold back.
Okay, thank you.
Can you identify yourself?
Okay, Yerevan Said from Ruda News Agency. I really don't think that, Kurdish politics is as divided as Washington politics. So my question is for Dennis. Why are you dismissing Kurds as opportunists? So what are the alternatives? Are you indicating that, Kurds simply just let, ISIS to take over the territories that are taken or liberated by the Kurds? That's one question. Also, one question for Dr. Sharif. How do you see KRG in 2 or 3 years? Are there any prospects of independence? Thank you.
Let's take another one. I see one right back here.
Gönül, I'd like to ask one question.
Please hold the
Can you-
microphone close to your mouth and speak clearly and loudly.
Carry a big stick. I'd like to ask one question. That is, if you look at Turkish policy towards the Kurds, the policy towards the KRG has been enormously, in my view, successful, because Turkey realized after a long while the strategic imperative of really working together with the KRG and the Iraqi Kurds. But now you have a new situation with the DYP and the Syrian Kurds. Why is it that Turkey is so hesitant to deal with the Syrian Kurds and does not employ the same strategy that it employed with the Iraqi Kurds, which was to sort of buy them out and make them dependent on Turkey economically?
Thank you. Could you identify yourself, please?
I did.
I didn't hear you.
Steve Larrabee, Rand.
Steve, good to see you.
Okay.
Richard McKee, I'm still with the State Department, but like Professor Natali, a non-policy. Okay, my name is Richard McKee. I'm still with State, but in a non-policy position like Professor Natali. I think we all agree that oil can be a curse. Look at the Gulf, look at the west coast of Africa. But Professor Natali, you twice said that it was a catastrophe, that the oil question, yeah.
Part of it, yeah.
Yeah. Could you sort of elaborate on why the exploitation of the oil and gas resources in the Kurdish Regional Government are so disastrous?
Why don't you start there?
Okay. Can I actually start with going with Yerevan?
Sure.
Hi, Yerevan. Nice to see you again. Look, I know you're referring to my Foreign Affairs article because I know some of the folks were not very happy with it. Nonetheless, look, there's a lot of opportunism. This is the politics of opportunism in post-ISIS Iraq or whatever in Syria. It's, again, and I have no dog in this fight, but if you take territories that you can't secure or pay for, someone's going to have to secure them for you. The coalition's not going to be the Air Force for the Kurds forever. So if all of these territories that the Kurds are being able to take, and they've extended far beyond the disputed territories in certain areas and oil fields, they're going to have to work that out with the Sunni Arabs and the communities that live there. So it's actually quite a dangerous policy, and I see this as, typical overstep. I mean, I think some of this problems never would have been there in the first place if you said, we don't really need to take these territories and we don't really need these territories. But you overstepped. So now you're in a mess, in a pickle, I would say, because many of the Sunni Arab communities that are from these areas can't go back. They're being put in detention centers. And again, I'm not blaming all the Kurdish leaders because they're making an effort. However, there's a lot of communities right now, not just the Kurds, saying that these are their territories, the Assyrians, the Yazidis. So, like I said, it's not about being opportunistic. It's about how are you going to pay for and secure and guard all of this extra land that they've taken. This is not the United States' responsibility to be the Air Force for the Kurds. So that's a problem that I still think it's going to happen, and that's due to political overstep, in my view. I do want to get to the oil question. When I say that, you can look at it two ways. In one way, people can say it's been fantastic, as Mohammed said, and he's right. I do not think that this figure that the oil minister goes to 2 million and 1 million, this is silly. There's about 250 coming out from the Kurdish region that they would say in their area, and much of this is from Kirkuk, that the Kurds have control right now. It is being sold in Jahan as Kirkuk oil under the State Oil Marketing Organization of Iraq, SOMO. Okay, this is still considered Iraqi oil. Did it help the Kurdistan region bring in oil companies? Absolutely. Did it develop the region? Absolutely. But the gamble I'm talking about, let's see if we can circumvent Baghdad and get our tankers out to sea, this has been a disaster. Because none of the oil, I don't care what has been said, has been sold at full price. Oil prices have dropped. Out of 10 years, there hasn't been a sovereign wealth fund created that has nothing to do with Maliki or the Iraqi government. There is not a dime in the Kurdistan region. So even a month before ISIS came, and this has nothing to do with ISIS, the region was bankrupt. So now you have, and I'm concerned about the people, quite frankly, there's $17 billion in debt, and many people are not getting their civil salaries. So if you want to create a structure, a large government function, in which 72% of the budget is for civil servant salaries, you're going to have a problem. And we're hearing the same rentier state issues that have, that's when I say this. And I think finally, I'm going to hit Steve's question while I'm here. Look, Turkey has been essential. It's been brilliant for Turkey, whether Erdogan did this intentionally or not. The Kurds have become a client state in Iraq of Turkey. It's got their oil, it's got their money, they can't move anywhere. So some people said Erdogan didn't do this intentionally. Whatever he did right, because he's working with Baghdad. There's more oil coming out of the northern corridor than ever before. And I think Ankara has played that. The reason why the PYD can't be treated like the Iraqi Kurds is, like I said, these are four distinct problems. The territorial integrity of the Turkish state is sacrosanct. So the Iraqi Kurds, in my view, are not threatening the territorial integrity of Turkey. In Turkey's mind, the PYD, i.e. the PKK, still is. Mm-hmm. And I think as long as that issue of what the PKK or PYD wants, and as long as Turkey perceives this as threatening their territorial integrity, you're not going to have the similar policy.
Yeah, and just to add on what I completely agree. I think the Turkey's KRG policy has been really brilliant, and it worked fine. And in a recent column for the Turkish Daily Radikal, I raised the same question. And Denise is right. The Syrian Kurds are the bad Kurds. They are affiliated with the PYD, and they pose a territorial challenge for the integrity of Turkish territory. But I think Turkey cannot really pursue a similar policy vis-à-vis the Syrian Kurds as long as it fails to solve its own Kurdish problem, and as long as the PKK fails to disarm within Turkey. But also there is another factor that is important, and that will really change the course of Turkish policy vis-à-vis the Syrian Kurds, and that's how Turkey's Kurds will do after the elections. I mean, if they are, right now, no one, the peace process has been stalled, and the government and the Kurdish part, they really don't want to do anything to hurt the calm in the region. So quietly, the Kurds are building their own institutions in the Kurdish region, and they're even talking about launching a Kurdish parliament if the HDP fails to make it on June 7th. And there are so many civil society organizations, and they actually established a de facto autonomous region. And if they cannot, everything will be fine if the HDP makes it to the parliament, because then HDP now has this wider coalition, so it will become a party of Turkey. It will, I think, it will quit its focus on the Kurdish issue, and will be presenting itself as a liberal party. They have Armenians, they have Assyrians on their lists. They even have a lesbian woman on their list. So they are presenting themselves as a party that is a lot more than a Kurdish party. Mm-hmm. So they are offering themselves as a liberal alternative to the AKP. So if they can actually make it, that's fine. And I think at the end of the day, Turkey will be able to pursue a similar approach in Syria. But if they cannot make it to the parliament, then that de facto autonomy and traditionally the organic link between Turkey's Kurds and Syrian Kurds are very strong. And Turkey will feel threatened by that. And especially after Kobani, there is this, yes, there are still many political divisions within the Kurdish movement in the region, but there is also this sense of let's set aside our problems and get together. I was in Cizre, and there was a basketball game between a Kurdish group from Cizre and an Iraqi Kurdish group from Erbil. And this weekend there will be an event on how can we reconstruct Kobani that will have representatives from Iraqi Kurdistan, from Syria, and from Turkey. So there is that sense of unity, and I think if that would pose a challenge in the long run. And so that's why I think it's critical that the HDP is represented in the parliament after June 7th elections.
Well, it's an interesting thesis that what Turkey really needs is Kurdish representation in parliament.
Yes, Turkish democracy needs.
Mohammed, it's been suggested several times that the Kurds have taken far more land inside Iraq than they had ever claimed previously, and this has been seen so far in the discussion as a drawback, a negative. But I'm wondering, I mean, doesn't it create the precondition for a land for peace deal between Baghdad and Erbil, and is that where things are headed?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I'd just like to add to what Dr. Gul said with regards to the Syrian-Turkish relations, especially relations with Syrian Kurds. All we have to do is go back to 1991 and onwards, and we saw how hostile Turkey was towards the Iraqi Kurds. And now we can see that the Iraqi Kurds have become great allies of Turkey, and this is only a matter of time that these things could evolve and change, and Syrian Kurds also emerge as good friends of Turkey. That's just one example. And I'd also like to add something else with regard to what my dear friend Dr. Denise Natali said. I mean, the Kurds are currently exporting 550,000 barrels per day based on an agreement with Baghdad. 300,000 barrels comes from the Kirkuk oil fields. Kirkuk, by the way, has the capacity to produce 350,000 barrels, and only 250,000 barrels are coming from Kurdistan region proper. So it's not only Kirkuk oil that's being exported, it's both the Kirkuk, which is currently under de facto Kurdish control, and oil that is being produced within the Kurdistan region proper. Another point that I'd like to highlight is with regards to the $7 billion of debt with which my friend highlighted. It's true the Kurdistan region is under heavy debt, but we have to make the argument, you all know, ladies and gentlemen, that Baghdad suspended funds to the Kurdistan region since February last year. And it's only been sending after a few agreements, a few, $500 here and then, starting from December onwards. It's quite obvious to, and as I presented in my, show you in my presentation, the Kurdistan region needs $1 billion per month. So obviously it has to withdraw money from other sources so it can maintain this entity. And going back to the question by Yerevan, with regards to Kurdish prospects for independence, the Kurdish project for independence is live and well, but what I would argue is that it has been delayed and postponed. But basically because of what is happening with regards to the Islamic State, and the Kurdish leadership, I think at the moment is being pragmatic and realistic, trying to deal with this situation. But I can genuinely assert to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the Kurdish people want independence. And as democratic leaders, as legitimate leaders, the Kurdish leadership will ultimately have to comply with the requirements of the Kurdish people. With regard to 2-3 years, I think you're being far too optimistic. I think 2-3 years is not enough to achieve independence, but we can just go back to the East Timor example. In 1999, the East Timorese people held a referendum under UN supervision, but their declaration of independence was in 2002. And based on what I've read recently, on the 1st of March 2015, the Kurdistan Parliament established an independent electoral commission, which has been tasked with the referendum towards independence. I don't know when it's going to happen, but I think the process will gradually evolve. As for what Mr. Serwer said with regards to the land, I think it is a fantastic opportunity. The Kurds have been suffering since the toppling of Saddam Hussein with regards to their border disputes. The Kurds have, as a result of the Daesh and the Islamic State incursions, increased their territory by around 30 to 40%. This is an excellent opportunity for Baghdad and Erbil to reach an agreement. There has to be compromises from Baghdad on that territory, and there has to be compromises on Erbil on that territory. As you all know, ladies and gentlemen, since the ratification of the Iraqi constitution and Article 140, the Maliki government has constantly denied the Kurds their right to the implementation. So based on this de facto control of Kurdish territory, by the way, I have to assert, most of that territory is Kurdish territory, it's not Arab territory. These are the lands that the Kurds have been claiming to be de-Arabized based on what Saddam Hussein and his regime have been doing from the 70s onwards. Of course, I agree with Denise Natali, there might have been mistakes here and there, a few bad apples, but the policy of the Kurdistan region is to respect Arabs, not to put them into detention centers. I was in Iraqi Kurdistan in October. I visited my uncle's house. In one street alone, ladies and gentlemen, there were 3 Arab families. Multiply that by every street in Suleimani and in Kurdistan, there are more than 1.5 million displaced and Arab peoples living in the Kurdistan region. And I rest my case. Thank you very much.
Denise wants to cross-examine.
No. No cross-examine. I got no dog in this fight. I do want to answer. Dan made a good point. Dan asked a question. Can't the Kurds, having taken this territory, exchange land for oil with land for peace with Baghdad? Here's the issue. What has changed in this weakened Iraqi state, because we're not going to have the same Iraq as we once knew it, where the dialectic was the Kurds and Baghdad. Yes, there's the Baghdad-Erbil relationship, but this is now between the Kurds and the Sunni Arabs largely. Most of those, and this is why I find it so dangerous to say that, you know, this is just the Kurds and it's mine. Most of those territories, and I'm not going to get into what's mine, this is largely Kurdish. The fact is, Sunni Arabs still claim this territory. Mosul is the heart of Sunni Arab nationalism. Some of those oil fields in Bashika are very, very dicey, where ExxonMobil is, and the Arab communities also claim that is theirs. When ExxonMobil signed that deal, what did the sons of Nineveh say? We will blow up this territory if you dare go near it. So the point is, there's still contention. There are many Shia saying, we don't need to do anything. We're not going to fight for the disputed territories. We know this is between the Sunni Arabs and the Kurds. So the Kurds now have a 1,000-kilometer border, and this goes back, Yervan, if I was Kurdish, I would be very concerned about this. They got a 1,000-kilometer border with, i.e. former ISIS people, I don't know what you want to call it, but these are very angry people that once were working with the Kurds. So how this land for peace is going to work out, it's going to be with the Sunni Arabs. And that's also going to mean revenue sharing. If you want to take Kirkuk, then those revenues are going to have to be shared as well. So I think it's become far more complicated than the Kurds in Baghdad cutting a deal. And that goes to my other point is, I think we've so overdetermined this leverage. Every time Barzani says we're going to have an independent state, Washington is trembling. We have to look at this in regional perspective. I don't think it's the United States that's going to say the Kurds can have a state or not. Ask Turkey, ask Iran. If tomorrow the Kurdistan region wanted a state with Erbil, Duhok, and Suleimania, they probably could get it. But will they be willing to accept a state without 2 key areas? That's parts of Mosul and Kirkuk. So that's the issue, is what would the borders look like, and will Arab Iraqis, who are pretty much still committed to their Iraqi entity, whatever, in what form, will they agree to that? And that's why you go back to how stable will this region be under the conditions that they're calling for a state. It's not Washington's choice to make. It's the regional states neighboring the Kurds.
Thank you, Denise. Let me take three more, one right here. Well, you had one before, right? No, let's take you. Oh, you didn't have one?
This John.
Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is John. I'm with the Turkish Embassy. First of all, I don't think that Syrian Kurds are equal to PYD. There are other Syrian Kurdish factions, parties. That's a fact. Second one, my knowledge is PYD was the reluctant part when Pesh wanted to move through Turkey into Kobani, not the other way around, because PYD did not want to work with first the opposition and the rest of the Kurdish parties, and I think not with the KRG. This is the other part of the story, and I'm glad that you addressed to the issue of the constitution, which is not raised, in this whole discussion, which identifies Iraq as a federal country. But the anomaly here is that it is a federal country, country with only one federal region. So this has been the problem all along. I mean, decentralization. I mean, and when you look at the constitution itself. Look at the oil and energy provisions. I mean, what Turkey has done, don't forget, came after Exxon, Total, and rest of the giant oil companies moved into the KRG. So we believe that it wasn't against the constitution, and that constitution foresees, if, for example, the central government wants to move troops into KRG, they want to ask for a permission, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong. So I think what we believe is that if this constitution is upheld with decentralization, as Denise Natali addressed, revenue sharing and power sharing. This hasn't been the case over the past, 2 years, until ISIS moved in 2 weeks up until Mosul. The issue of decentralization again came to the fore, which is very important for Iraq and the region, I think. This is how we look at the situation. And I think the Sunnis and the rest of the Iraqis would like to benefit from this decentralized kind of political system. That is how we see it. And I don't think that what Turkey has done with KRG runs against the territorial integrity or the unity of the Iraqi state. From our point of view, it strengthens it. And I think in Syria, PYD does not represent the whole Kurdish community. And PYD also is not equal to the Syrian opposition or anti-Daesh, not at all. There are other groups, and if first the big problem is Daesh and then the regime, which reportedly there are still links with the PYD. I just wanted to provide this context, and thanks for allowing me to share this.
Thank you. Let me take this lady in the red and black dress right here.
Hello, my name's Ann Bodine, not affiliated with any organization, but I have worked in Iraq for the U.S. government previously. I just want to follow up on what Denise said, and I largely agree with her points. Looking at whether or not the KRG became independent, you have these complicating factors of Kirkuk and Mosul. But on a larger context, I'd like to get your thoughts on going back to what you said about the Treaty of Sèvres. One of the concerns back after World War I is why the plebiscite was not followed through on, and you didn't have independent Kurdistan. Largely the British feeling that taking the Kurds out of the equation would simply strengthen the influence of Iran. And don't you have that same dynamic today? And looking down the road, I understand the Gulf Arabs and the US and Turkey have these short-term interests. But if you look down the road, don't we have that same dynamic? When you take the Kurds out of the equation in Iraq, you've strengthened the Iranian hand there.
Thank you. Let me go back to the panel. Anybody want to respond?
I can respond to John's question. I mean, he said that the PYD doesn't represent the whole Kurds. That's true, but the PYD is the dominant force within the Syrian Kurdish community. Otherwise, the US would have worked with someone else if there was another Kurdish group. And also, you mentioned that the PYD did not want to join the Syrian opposition initially themselves, and initially yes, but I think they could have been engaged and they could have been part of the Syrian opposition, and the only reason they that they did not become part of the Syrian opposition was that Turkey used its leverage over the Syrian opposition not to address the Kurdish question in a post-Assad Syria. If you remember, there was the Friends of Syria meeting in Tunisia where the Kurds left the conference because the Syrian opposition would not want to talk about what will happen to the Kurds once the Assad regime is gone. And I think in that regard, Turkey's Syria policy failed because Turkey could have engaged. I mean, from a realpolitik perspective, I understand, but still, Turkey mostly focused on the PYD. So when Turkey looked at Syria, that was the first thing that the Turkish government saw, and I think that was a miscalculation.
Just to add, first of all, with regard to the questions from the gentleman from the Turkish embassy, again, I agree with what Dr. Gul said with regards to Syrian Kurds and their relations with Turkey and that with the United States. But with regard to your second point about the Iraqi constitution, absolutely, I totally agree with you. It was very soon after Saddam Hussein was toppled in 2003 that Abdul Aziz al-Hakim of the Islamic Revolutionary Council at the time asked that a Shiite region be established. And much later on, in 2011, the provinces of Anbar, the province of Nainawa, the province of Salah ad-Din, their provincial councils voted for a federal entity. It was rejected by the Maliki government. And I totally agree, possibly with the mechanism stipulated in the Iraqi constitution and these federal entities emerging within Iraq, I think would have been in a much more peaceful place. But unfortunately, the Maliki government refused to allow the establishment of these federal entities, whether they be Shiite or Sunni. And as you said, there is one federal entity in Iraq, and that's Kurdistan.
Thank you. Denise?
Yeah. Hi, John. It's good to see you again. But your point is well taken. Gönül's right. The Syrian Kurds and Mohammed, that the vast majority of influence is the PYD. However, there's lots of independent Kurds that are saying, they just don't have the resources right now. But I think your more important point is when the KRG Peshmerga were brought into Turkey, absolutely, they did not want them coming in. And this underlines, really, we can't miss this, the important divisions, I don't care what anybody says, between these groups. They are stronger now than they ever have been, not like the Civil War, but the fact is the PYD and the KDP, whatever, are certainly not operating under a unified command, and each are vying to lead the Kurdish nationalist movement under different leaders in different moments. So there's still divisions and those weaknesses, John. Now, look, at the 2005 Constitution is a disaster. Okay, I think that this was, not only dismembering the Iraqi state, but it left so many ambiguities that the whole idea of revenue sharing and power sharing has been left to different interpretations. The Kurds have their interpretation, the Iraqis, and so forth. So yes, you can say we're just abiding by the Constitution, but then there's so many different articles that contradict each other, particularly over oil, that this is what's gotten it into a mess. I think it's important, we have to at some point stop blaming Maliki. He's gone, okay? The reason that there's no decentralized other areas, it's not just because of Maliki, it's because other regions didn't vote for it. Not all Sunni groups are calling for their own region. There's actually some Sunni groups saying that we want to work with the Iraqi government, we just want more arms. There's some Sunni groups saying that we want some form of decentralization, but we don't want our own region. So this is a myth to think that all of the Sunnis are looking for their own region. And secondly, none of them are calling for separation from Iraq. Now, Anne asked a question about Iran. First of all, having this entity is it going to strengthen Iran? Look, the Iranians won't have it in the first place. Period, end of story. If you think that the Iranians have so much influence among the Kurds, and I'm not saying this as this is a bad thing or a good thing, they share a border, they're landlocked and they deal with the Iranians. But this is not a country that is looking weak anytime soon. So I just don't see again how, unless there's some kind of deal that they will become a vassal state of the Iranians, that the Kurds. Still, yeah, it's hard for me to envision this. Well, you're saying that Iraq breaks up and the rest of Iraq becomes, again, this is.
You take the Kurds out of the equation.
I know, but you know, there's this phobia that they're thinking that, well, the Iraqis border Iran. Prime Minister Abadi was in town and he made this very clear in a very succinct message. The Iraqis have to deal with the Iranians. They don't want the Iranians. They don't have this love for the Iranians to intervene in Iraq. There's a strong sense of Iraqi identity still. So dealing and having to cut the deals with the Iranians and having the Iranians taking over Iraq. You heard the statements he made about Qasem Soleimani coming into Iraq. So I'm not so sure that it would just fall to Iran. But again, this. Yeah, I know, there always will be too.
I thought I might just add a word that it seems to me very clear that at some time in the future, this question of other federal units inside Iraq will be decided in accordance with the referendum procedures of the Iraqi constitution. There are a number of proposed regions, and I think it's going to be very difficult for any prime minister to continue to do what Nouri al-Maliki did, which was to just reject the possibility out of hand. And I think it's quite clear that Haider al-Abadi does not have that intention. So some of these questions of asymmetric federalism may actually be decided someday, and I don't think we should hold our breath, but at the same time, I think we should anticipate that they be decided democratically. I have to add a word about what Denise says about Iran. I agree completely. Eastern Kurdistan is inside Iran. I've never met an Iranian who wasn't very clear on the subject of Kurdish independence in Iraq. They don't want to see it. Judith, then there, then there. And that will be the end of our...
Thank you. Thank you very much. Judith Yaffe from George Washington University. I want to endorse what Denise has said, every point, because she's got it absolutely correct. But I'd like to go a little bit further than that. The Constitution was meant to be a vague document because nobody wanted to take on the big issues, knowing that everything would collapse if they took on the oil issue or anything else. She's right on what the Sunnis want, but everybody assumes, especially here, they know what the Iraqis or the Kurds or the Sunnis want, and you don't. But the one thing that bothers me most, well, a couple things bother me. First of all, the Kurds, having been strong supporters and drafters of this constitution, have taken the opportunity when they saw it to only accept the parts they want and to take advantage of weakness in Baghdad to seize territory or to move on other areas. That's not very constitutional. I want to know, what will the Kurds do if and the ISIS border involves much more than just Kurdish territory. Will the Kurds fight outside Kurdistan for Iraq, for that so-called federal state that they supposedly supported and helped build? Will they allow a national force, whether it's the National Guard, whatever that's going to mean, if it's created, or any other so-called national force, to position itself inside Kurdish region to protect the Kurds in all of Iraq, which they have not allowed yet? I wish land for peace were an option. I just don't see it.
Judith?
No. One more. I want to take this back. You ignored one point. I'm sorry. You ignored one thing. That's the U.S. in this. And you've talked it. No, I don't want to talk about election. Yeah. The Constitution, not the Constitution, but the Congress. Congress does not make foreign policy. The president does. We all seem to forget that. Now, Congress has a role in shaping it. I'm not arguing that. But because Congress says, oh, the Kurds should be recognized and as independent, and the Sunnis should be recognized as independent, that's not foreign policy, and I don't think it's going to contribute to it because, A, of a lack of understanding, but the other thing is it hasn't been our policy to date. And I wonder if they start to look at politics within Kurdistan, how will they feel about Masoud Barzani trying to go extra constitutionally for a third term and maybe for a lifetime service as president?
Thank you, Judith. Somebody there.
My name is Brenna Allen. I work at RAND, and I just wanted to ask if the Kurds were able to declare independence, whether through a referendum or some other means, what leverage would Baghdad have to stop them and make that bid a failure?
One more.
I'm Alex Ebser. I'm from the Kurdistan Regional Government. I was wondering, so the deal that was made in December was to exchange oil for the resumption of payments to the KRG, and you know, this is not something that's constitutional. A region's receiving oil revenues is not part of is not part of their production. You know, it's tied to their population and other things. I was wondering, what do you think is the prospects for resuming these payments? You know, they are coming slowly, but not at the level that was agreed. So I was wondering if you could talk about that.
What I'm going to do is go back through the speakers, ask them to pick up on which questions they like, or make any other points they want to make in conclusion. Gönül?
Well, our Iraq expert should answer the questions.
Okay,
first.
I'll start off with Dr. Judith Yafi's question with regards to the Kurds taking advantage. I beg to differ. It was the Islamic State that launched incursions into Kurdish territory, and it was the Kurds that protected these territories from a radical terrorist organization. Number one. Number two, I also beg to differ where you argue that the Kurds implement parts of the constitution that favor them and parts that they don't. I remember meeting Professor Brendan O'Leary once, and he played a major role in advising how to write the constitution. And I remember he had sort of a debate with an Arab academic. This was in London. And he said, well, this is the article, that Arab academic was saying the certain article is vague, blah, blah, blah. And then Professor Brendan O'Leary said, well, you choose to interpret it as vague. It is not vague. It was intended with this purpose. And I think there are people who want to present these articles as vague because they are benefiting from it. As for the Kurds fighting outside the Kurdistan region, I wouldn't be able to answer that question properly because the Kurds have limited resources. The Kurds have around 200,000 Peshmerga, and it would be probably difficult to control areas outside of Kurdistan. This would be probably too much of a demand. As for President Barzani running for a third term, this is currently being debated by the major powers in Kurdistan. Kurdistan, as you know, is a democratic entity. There are 5 major democratically elected groups at the moment. They are debating the constitution of Kurdistan at the moment, and it will be based on these discussions whether President Barzani will get a third term or not. As for Baghdad, what leverage Baghdad will have with regards to the Kurds gaining independence, I think Baghdad is quite weak at the moment. And what I hope will happen is some sort of velvet divorce based on the definition of borderlines, the borders between Kurdistan and Arab Iraq, and maybe the United States could play a role in these negotiations. As I said, there will have to be compromises both from the Kurdish leadership in the Kurdistan region and from Arab Iraq, and hopefully it will be a bloodless separation, a velvet divorce on a par with what happened to Czechoslovakia in 1993. The Czech Republic and the Slovakians separated amicably. So that's what I have to say at the moment. Thank you very much.
I would only note that the precondition for a velvet divorce is a secure agreement on what line
That's right.
exists
That's right.
between
That's right.
the divorcees.
Yeah.
Who gets what?
Gönül, would Turkey accept a velvet divorce?
I think in Iraq, I posed the question, how once the Islamic State threat is under control in Iraq, will Turkey still keep doing business with Kirkuk that's under the control of the KRG? And I think it will, because so far it has been quite pragmatic in its approach with the Iraqi Kurds. But again, the question of how Turkey will have different approaches vis-a-vis Kurds within different nation states. So with regard to Syria, I think it will largely depend on Turkey's own Kurdish problem. And just to wrap up, I just want to say that yes, this is a historic moment for the Kurds in Turkey, the Kurds in Syria, and the Kurds in Iraq. And they are very confident, and I could see that traveling in the Kurdish region in Turkey. But still, the future course of Kurdish political movement in the region will largely depend on the response of the nation states that these Kurds are part of. And also, the sense within Turkey's Kurdish political movement was we have the backing of the US and the Western world. But I think, as Denise Natali said before, the US, there's a confusion there. They just want to see this as a strategic shift in the US policy vis-a-vis the Kurds, when in fact it's just a tactical shift. So I think they should be careful not to overplay their hand.
Denise?
Yes, good. Thank you. Just a couple of points. Brendan, you wrote from RAND, you asked a question about leverage. No, but again, they used to say even during Maliki should declare Kurdish statehood. I mean, because tomorrow, it's not how much leverage does Baghdad have. Like I said, the Iraqis and Shia, Sunni, I don't care. They'll say to the Kurds today, go ahead, you can go have a state. You just can't take the Iraqi oil with you. So it's not about, I don't look at this as, will Baghdad tell the Kurds you can't do it? It's, what will be the arrangements, as Dan said, of what borders will look like. And that's going to have to be a deal made between the Kurds and the Sunnis. Here's a question to ask. What happens if a Sunni region is formed next to the Kurdistan region? What will those borders look like? So I think right now a more salient question would be, how will those resources in those very sensitive areas of Nineveh be shared with the Sunni communities in those areas? Okay, that to me is where it would be. And again, if those two sensitive areas of Kirkuk and Mosul are to me very important. So now, I don't want to get into this about who said what and who did what, decentralization for Iraq, but the fact of the matter is, since 2003, I was just there for about 6 years, this third time, and we used to watch overnight. 2003, they'd go in, and again, there was a security vacuum. We can't forget, Iraq was a mess. The Kurdistan region was relatively stable. The Peshmerga would move in 2 clicks. Then my friends in the security companies would say, oh my gosh, they moved another 2 clicks. So the fact of the matter is, the border has been expanded and expanded over 8 years' time. When you look at where the ISIS threats are occurring right now, it is really no surprise that it's occurring in the disputed territories. And if we look at ISIS as more than sacred values, but angry former Baathists, this area of where it's playing out is, in my view, a lot to do with Kurdish overstep. So, and finally, there has been double standards. Decentralization for Iraq, centralization for Kurdistan. So you can't play it both ways. And this is not coming to me, I'm speaking from me. This comes to me from my Kurdish colleagues. I get dozens of emails, So I'm sorry you're shaking your head and if this is offending you, but the reality of the facts on the ground. I don't work for advocacy group, so this is not emotional. This is about leverage. When we're talking about, I actually find this thing about statehood just remarkable because it's more salient in Washington than elsewhere. How much leverage does the Kurdistan region really have? So you have to ask, where are the resources coming from? Right now, I see the region as more dependent on Baghdad than ever before and dependent on Turkey. So when 95% of your revenues, and not wishing anything, still come from one source, then there's an issue. And even Turkey working with the Kurdistan Regional Government, they're selling the oil as Kirkuk crude. So until some of those oils can be sold as Kurdish crude, and the exporter is not SOMO, but KOMO, then I really don't know yet, and you have, how we can realistically be talking about when the Kurdish state's going to happen. It's what kind of compromises are the Kurds willing to take or to make territorially, if they want really to have a state. Thank you.
I left to think that 10 years ago, a lot of people thought all these problems had been solved in
No.
the new Iraqi constitution. They're clearly not solved yet. There's clearly an enormous, rich background to these issues, and one that I suspect will provide us with many more events at the Middle East Institute before it's all over. But I want to thank this panel heartily for a terrific set of presentations. Thank you.
Thank you.